Hello everyone, welcome to Azad Revenge Stories channel. Confess now and we'll make this easy for you. Those words hit me like ice water as I stared at the three faces surrounding my desk that Tuesday morning. Department head Garrett Nolan stood directly in front of me, his arms crossed, and that same practiced expression of disappointment he'd worn for the past 6 weeks. To his right, Assistant Manager Delilah Voss tapped her pen against her notepad with the rhythm of a countdown timer. And there was Kimberly Hatch from accounting, the woman who used to text me funny memes during boring meetings, who now couldn't even look me in the eye. I already told you yesterday and the day before that, and every single day for the past month, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I didn't take any money. Garrett's laugh was sharp and hollow. 41 days, fear. 41 days, we've been asking you the same question, and 41 days you've given us the same lie. That's when I knew they'd been counting. They'd been keeping track of every single day. They'd circled my cubicle like predators, wearing me down with their questions and accusations. The realization that this was all calculated, all planned, sent something cold sliding down my spine. My name is Fear Caldwell. I'm 28 years old, and until 6 weeks ago, I thought I understood how the world worked. I thought hard work and honesty mattered. I thought the people you trusted with your morning coffee complaints and weekend plans would stand by you when things got difficult. I was wrong about everything. Let me pause for a moment here because I need you to understand something. Before I go any further, could you please take a few seconds to tell me in the comments where you're watching this from? Because I want to know that my story reached people who understand what it feels like to be completely alone in a room full of colleagues who have already decided you're guilty. And please hit that like button and subscribe because stories like this need to be heard. People need to know that sometimes the quiet ones, the ones who keep their heads down and do their work, we are the ones who see everything. The missing money was $18,000 from our department's quarterly budget. Not a small amount, but not life-changing either. What made it worse was how perfectly it fit their narrative. I was the newest team member, barely 18 months into my position as budget coordinator. I had access to the accounts. I lived alone in a tiny apartment and drove a car that made concerning noises when I turned left. To them, I was the obvious suspect. But here's what they didn't know. During those 41 days of interrogation, I wasn't just sitting there taking their abuse. I was watching. I was listening. And I was starting to notice things that didn't add up, like how Delilah always seemed to know exactly what questions to ask, as if she'd already seen the financial records before our meetings, or how Garrett's concern about the missing funds felt rehearsed, too smooth, like he'd practiced his worried supervisor routine in the mirror. And Kimberly, sweet, loyal Kimberly, who'd supposedly discovered the discrepancy, why did she seem more nervous than angry about the theft? On day 15 of their campaign against me, something interesting happened. I was eating lunch alone in the break room because by then word had spread that I was under investigation and most people had started avoiding me when I overheard Delilah on a phone call in the hallway. "No, we stick to the timeline," she was saying, her voice lower than usual. "Another few weeks and she'll crack. Then we close this whole thing and move forward with the next phase." Next phase. What next phase? That's when I started paying real attention to their behavior, not just during our daily interrogation sessions, but throughout the entire workday. I began eating lunch in different locations, timing my bathroom breaks to coincide with theirs, staying late to observe who was working when they thought no one was watching. And that's how I met Evelyn. Evelyn Carmichael was 73 years old, the CEO's mother, and she volunteered in our office twice a week, helping with filing and administrative tasks. Most people were politely friendly to her, but didn't really engage. She was just the boss's elderly mom who liked to stay busy. But during those long, lonely weeks when my coworkers had turned against me, Evelyn became my unexpected companion. She had sharp eyes behind her reading glasses and a way of asking questions that felt like genuine curiosity rather than interrogation. While everyone else was whispering about my supposed crimes, Evelyn would sit beside me during lunch and ask about my weekend plans or share stories about her garden. "You know," she said during my 3rd week of exile, I've been coming to this office for almost 5 years now, and I've never seen people work so late as they have been recently. I looked up from my sandwich. What do you mean? Well, that lovely girl, Delilah, and your department head, what's his name, Garrett, they've been staying until quite late. Several evenings. Very dedicated, I suppose. Though I did think it odd that they were working in the conference room instead of at their desks. My pulse quickened. Which conference room? The small one on the third floor. The one with the broken lock that maintenance never seems to get around to fixing. That evening, I found an excuse to stay late. I told Garrett I wanted to review some files to see if I could figure out where the missing money had gone, which was true, just not in the way he thought. Around 7:30, when the office had mostly emptied out, I made my way to the third floor. The conference room Evelyn had mentioned was tucked away at the end of a hallway that most people rarely used, and she was right about the lock. The door didn't close properly, leaving just enough of a gap that someone could hear conversations inside. I didn't have to wait long. Barrett's voice carried clearly through the gap. The quarterly review is in 3 weeks. We need this wrapped up before then. She's tougher than we expected, Delilah replied. I really thought she'd break by now. Maybe we are approaching this wrong, said a third voice that made my stomach clench. Kimberly, what if we plant something more concrete? Something that looks like she was trying to cover her tracks. No, Garrett said firmly. We stick to the plan. Pressure and repetition. Eventually, she'll confess just to make it stop. Then we have our scapegoat, and we can continue our operations without scrutiny. Operations. Scapegoat. The words crash over me like revelation and Norser combined. They weren't trying to find the person who stole $18,000. They were trying to pin it on me to cover up something much bigger. I spent the rest of that evening in my car in the parking garage, my hands shaking as I processed what I'd heard. Everything made sense now. The coordinated questioning, the way they seemed more interested in getting a confession than actually investigating, Kimberly's nervous energy whenever she had to look at me directly. But knowing the truth and proving it were two different things. I needed evidence and I needed a plan. That's when I started my own investigation. I began by mapping out their patents. Barrett and Delilah met in that conference room every Tuesday and Thursday after hours. Kimberly joined them about half the time. I started documenting everything, who stayed late on which days, unusual access to financial systems, any conversations I could overhear. Meanwhile, my friendship with Evelyn deepened. During our lunch conversations, I learned that she wasn't just the CEO's mother making busy work for herself. She was sharp, observant, and deeply protective of her son's reputation. She'd worked as a bookkeeper for 30 years before retiring, and she understood business operations better than most people gave her credit for. My son works so hard, she told me one afternoon. He trusts his department heads completely. Sometimes I worry that his faith in people might be too generous. What do you mean? I asked carefully. Oh, just little things I notice. People who say one thing to his face and another when they think he can't hear. It breaks my heart, really. He believes the best in everyone. As the days crawled by and my daily interrogations continued, I started sharing small observations with Evelyn, not accusations or theories, just things I'd noticed. How certain people seemed to work unusual hours. How some financial discrepancies might be more complex than they appeared. How sometimes the people pointing fingers loudest might have their own reasons for wanting attention focused elsewhere. Evelyn listened to everything with the careful attention of someone who'd spent decades managing other people's money and understanding their motivations. On day 38 of my ordeal, I finally found what I was looking for. I'd started coming in early, arriving at 6:30 in the morning when the building was nearly empty. That Thursday, I was reviewing some routine expense reports when I noticed something odd in the vendor payment system. There were payments going to companies I'd never heard of, small amounts, usually just under the threshold, that would require additional approval, but they were consistent and frequent. I cross-referenced the vendor names with our approved supplier list. Half of them weren't there. My hands moved quickly across the keyboard as I dug deeper. These phantom vendors had been receiving payments for months, not just from our department, but from 3 others as well. The amounts were carefully calculated to stay below audit triggers, and they were always approved by either Garrett or similar department heads in other divisions. But here's what made my blood run cold. The bank routing numbers for these fake vendors all led back to the same account, an account that had been opened 18 months ago, right around the time the new financial software system had been implemented. The same system that Delilah had been instrumental in setting up and training people to use. They hadn't just stolen $18,000. They'd been running a systematic embezzlement operation that had probably netted them hundreds of thousands over the past year and a half. The missing money from our budget wasn't the crime. It was their mistake, their slip-up that threatened to expose everything. And rather than confess or fix their error, they decided to destroy an innocent person to protect their operation. That night, I printed everything: bank records, vendor payment histories, email trails showing who had approved what transactions. I organized it all into a clear, undeniable timeline that showed exactly how the scheme worked and who was involved. But I didn't turn it in immediately. Instead, I spent my weekend thinking about something Evelyn had said during one of our conversations. The worst betrayals aren't about money, they're about trust. When someone takes advantage of your faith in them, that's what really breaks your heart. These people hadn't just tried to steal money and pin it on me. They'd spent 41 days systematically destroying my reputation, my relationships, and my sense of security. They'd isolated me from my colleagues, made me doubt my own memory and perception, and turned people I trusted into strangers who whispered when I walked by. They'd made me feel small and powerless and guilty for crimes I hadn't committed. It was time to return the favor. On Monday morning, day 42 of their campaign against me, I walked into the office with a plan that felt both terrifying and necessary. The quarterly review meeting was scheduled for 10:00 a.m., with all department heads, senior management, and several board members in attendance. According to the agenda I'd seen, my case was listed as a brief update under personnel matters, probably just a quick announcement that they'd resolved the theft and were moving forward with appropriate disciplinary action. They had no idea what was coming. I spent the morning working quietly at my desk, responding to their usual questions with the same calm denials I'd given for 6 weeks. But this time, when Garrett asked if I had anything else to say about the missing funds, I surprised him. Actually, yes. I'd like to address this in the quarterly meeting today in front of everyone. Delilah and Kimberly exchanged glances. That's not really necessary, Delilah said quickly. We can handle this matter privately. No, I said, meeting her eyes steadily. I think after 401 days of being accused of theft, I deserve the chance to speak publicly about what really happened to that money. Eric frowned. Dear, if you're planning to confess, that's admirable, but we don't need to make it a spectacle. I'm not confessing to anything, but I'm ready to tell the truth. At 10:00 a.m. sharp, I walked into the main conference room where 23 people sat around the large oak table. Department heads, managers, board members, and, at the far end, CEO Harrison Carmichael himself. And there, sitting in the chair reserved for special guests, was Evelyn, who had come to observe the meeting as she sometimes did. When Garrett introduced my case, presenting it as a simple matter of employee theft that had been resolved, I stood up. I'm sorry, but that's not accurate. I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room, and I think everyone here deserves to know what really happened to that $18,000. The room went dead silent. Harrison leaned forward slightly, his attention focused entirely on me. Please go ahead. I had prepared for this moment, but standing there with all those eyes on me, I felt the weight of everything I was about to reveal. These people had tried to destroy me. Now it was my turn. The missing money from our departmental budget wasn't stolen by an employee, I began. It was a mistake in a much larger embezzlement operation that has been running for over 18 months. And then I began to lay out everything I discovered. I pulled out the first document from my folder. These are bank records showing payments to 17 different vendors over the past year and a half. Vendors that don't exist in our approved supplier database. I handed copies to Harrison and placed the originals on the projector. Numbers and company names filled the screen behind me. These fake vendors received a total of $237,000 in payments, all approved by department heads who claimed they were legitimate business expenses. The routing numbers for all these payments lead to the same bank account." Harrison's face had gone completely serious. Around the table, I could see department heads shifting in their seats, some looking confused, others starting to look worried. The $18,000 that went missing from our budget. That was an error. Someone got sloppy and tried to process a payment to one of these fake vendors using funds that were too easily traceable. When the discrepancy was discovered, rather than risk exposure of the entire operation, certain people decided it would be easier to blame a convenient target. I looked directly at Garrett, whose face had drained of color. For 41 days, I was subjected to daily interrogations, accused of theft, and systematically isolated from my colleagues. Not because anyone actually believed I was guilty, but because I was the perfect scapegoat, knew enough to be expendable with access to the accounts and no powerful allies to defend me. Delilah started to speak, but Harrison held up his hand. "Let her finish. During those 41 days, while I was being hunted like a criminal, I was actually investigating the real crime. I documented after-hours meetings where the scheme was discussed and planned. I traced the financial records that showed exactly how the embezzlement system works, and I identified every person involved in defrauding this company." The tension in the room was electric. I could see sweat beating on Garrett's forehead, and Kimberly had gone so pale I thought she might faint. But I wasn't done yet. "The financial crimes are serious enough," I continued. "But what makes this truly despicable is how these same people have been treating the person they are supposed to respect most." I turned toward Evelyn, who was watching the proceedings with sharp attention. "Mrs. Carmichael, you've been volunteering here for 5 years. You've been kind to everyone, helpful and generous with your time. You've treated the people in this company like family." Evelyn nodded slightly, though I could see confusion in her eyes about where I was heading. "What you don't know is how some of those people talk about your son when they think no one is listening." The air in the room shifted. Harrison sat up straighter, and I could see something dangerous flickering in his expression. "During one of their planning meetings, I heard Garrett refer to you, Mr. Carmichael, as too trusting to run a real business. Delilah called you naive and said you were easy to manipulate because you actually believe people are honest." Harrison's jaw tightened, but I kept going. Kimberly laughed when Delilah said, "Your mother was sweet but clueless," and joked that it was convenient having someone around who could be used as a character witness if anyone ever questioned their integrity. I watched Evelyn's face change as my words sank in. The kindness in her expression hardened into something I'd never seen before. Disappointment so profound. It was like watching someone's heart break in real time. "But the worst part," I said, my voice dropping to ensure everyone had to lean in to hear, "was when they discussed their long-term plans. Garrett told Delilah that once they'd accumulated enough through their embezzlement operation, they were going to frame some financial irregularities as executive mismanagement. They were planning to push you out, Mr. Carmichael, and position themselves to take over key leadership roles." The silence that followed was deafening. Harrison's face had gone from serious to furious, but it was Evelyn's reaction that made my chest tight with vindication and sadness. She was staring at Garrett, Delilah, and Kimberly with the expression of someone who had just discovered that people she'd baked birthday cakes for and asked about their families had been laughing at her behind her back for years. "Mrs. Carmichael," Delilah started, her voice shaking. "That's not, we never said those things." "Yes, you did." The interruption came from an unexpected source. Evelyn's voice was steady but carried a weight that made everyone in the room go completely still. Because now that she said it, I remember things. Comments I didn't understand at the time. Looks you shared when you thought I wasn't paying attention. The way conversations would stop when I entered a room. She stood up slowly, her 73-year-old frame somehow commanding the entire space. "For 5 years, I've been coming to this office because I wanted to help my son's business succeed. I've brought you homemade cookies and remembered your children's names and listened to your problems because I thought we were a community, a family." Her voice never rose above conversational level, but the pain in it was devastating. "And this entire time, you've been stealing from him. Stealing from this company that he built with his own hands and his own dreams. But worse than that, you've been laughing at him, at me, at our trust." Kimberly burst into tears. Not the careful, calculated tears of someone trying to manipulate a situation, but the ugly, desperate sobbing of someone whose world was collapsing. She looked at Evelyn with such raw anguish that for a moment I'd almost felt sorry for her. "Mrs. Carmichael, please," she gasped between sobs. "I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted any of this. They said it was just small amounts that no one would get hurt. And then it got bigger, and I couldn't stop. And when the money went missing, I was so scared." "Stop!" Barrett hissed at her. But it was too late. "I can't stop," Kimberly wailed. "I can't live with this anymore. She's been so kind to me. She asked about my daughter's recital last week, and I've been lying to her face for months, and I can't do it anymore." She turned to Harrison with tears streaming down her face. "It's all true. Everything she said is true. We set up the fake vendors. We've been taking money for over a year, and we blamed her because we thought she was weak enough to take the fall. And yes, we said those horrible things about you and your mother, and I hate myself for it. But I was so afraid of losing my job, and now I've lost everything anyway." The confession hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Harrison stood up slowly, his face a mask of controlled fury. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried the kind of authority that made grown men step backward. "Security will escort the three of you from the building immediately. You'll surrender all company property, and our legal team will be in contact about criminal charges and restitution. Your employment is terminated effective immediately." But even as security was called and the administrative machinery of justice began to turn, I found myself watching Evelyn. She was looking at Kimberly with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not anger exactly, but something deeper and more final. And that's when I realized that my revenge was just beginning. "Please tell me you're still with me, because this is where everything I'd planned finally started to work exactly the way I hoped." Hit that like button if you're feeling what I felt in that moment. The sweet, terrible satisfaction of watching people get exactly what they deserved. And make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next is going to show you that sometimes the most devastating revenge isn't about punishment. It's about truth. The meeting disbanded in chaos, but I stayed behind as people filed out in stunned silence. Harrison was speaking quietly with his legal team. Security was handling the escort of my former tormentors, and most of the other department heads were whispering urgently among themselves about what this meant for their own operations. But Evelyn hadn't moved from her chair. She sat there staring at the financial documents I'd left on the table, occasionally reaching up to adjust her reading glasses. When the room had mostly emptied, she looked up at me with eyes that seemed older than they had an hour ago. "You knew," she said quietly. "When you started having lunch with me, when you shared those little observations, you knew what they were doing." I sat down beside her, choosing my words carefully. I suspected something wasn't right, but I didn't know how deep it went until a few weeks ago, and you befriended me because you thought I could help you expose them. The directness of her statement caught me off guard. I had expected gratitude or shared anger or even questions about the evidence. I hadn't expected her to immediately understand the strategic element of our relationship. "Partly," I admitted, "but Mrs. Carmichael, everything I shared with you about what they said, that was real. They really did mock you and your son. They really were planning to push him out. I may have had ulterior motives for getting close to you, but I never lied to you about what I observed." She nodded slowly. "I know. That's why this hurts so much." Over the next few days, I watched my revenge unfold in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Getting Garrett, Delilah, and Kimberly fired was just the beginning. The real devastation was in how completely their lives unraveled afterward. Kimberly's breakdown in the meeting had been genuine, but it was only the start of her collapse. The guilt of betraying someone who had treated her with kindness, combined with the criminal charges she was facing, sent her into a spiral that affected every aspect of her life. Her husband filed for divorce within 2 weeks, citing the stress and financial uncertainty. Her daughter's private school asked her to find alternative arrangements when other parents learned about the embezzlement charges. But what destroyed her most was that she couldn't face Evelyn anymore. For 3 years, Evelyn had asked about her daughter's dance recital and brought her soup when she was sick and remembered her wedding anniversary. Kimberly had built her identity around being a good person who deserved that kindness. And now she had to live with knowing she'd spent months laughing behind the back of someone who genuinely cared about her. She tried to call Evelyn twice to apologize. Evelyn never answered. Garrett's situation was different, but equally devastating. He'd always prided himself on being untouchable, the kind of man who could manipulate any situation to his advantage. But his arrogance had made him careless, and once investigators started digging, they found evidence of other schemes he'd been running at previous companies. The criminal charges multiplied, and his carefully constructed reputation as a rising business leader crumbled overnight. His wife left him, but not because of the money. She left because she found out he'd been telling people at company events that she was high maintenance and not particularly bright. One of those people had been Evelyn, who mentioned the comment to Harrison, who mentioned it to his wife, who was friends with Barrett's wife. The personal betrayal hurt more than the financial crimes. Delilah tried to minimize her involvement, claiming she'd been coerced by Garrett, but the evidence showed she'd been the mastermind behind the fake vendor system. Worse, when she tried to reach out to former colleagues for character references, she discovered that her reputation for manipulation had preceded her. People had been afraid to cross her when she had power, but now that she didn't, they had no interest in helping her. Within 6 months, all 3 of them had lost their homes, their families, and any hope of working in their field again. The criminal trials were still pending, but their lives had already been dismantled piece by piece. But the most profound consequence wasn't what happened to them. It was what happened to Evelyn. 2 weeks after the meeting, she stopped coming to the office. Harrison told me she needed time to process what had happened, but I could see the worry in his expression. She'd always been the foundation of stability in his life, and watching her retreat from the world was affecting him deeply. I started visiting her at home. I know how that sounds. I know it seems calculated, like I was still working some angle. Maybe part of me was I'd spent so many weeks planning and scheming that it was hard to turn off that mindset. But mostly, I visited because I felt responsible for the sadness I'd seen in her eyes that day in the conference room. Her house was exactly what I'd expected, warm and comfortable, with family photos covering every surface and the kind of furniture that invited you to sit down and stay a while. But when she answered the door, she looked smaller somehow, like the betrayal had physically diminished her. "I've been thinking about what you said." She told me over tea in her kitchen about how you partly befriended me because you thought I could help you. "Mrs. Carmichael, I'm sorry if that hurt you. I was desperate." "And no," she interrupted, "I'm grateful for your honesty. It's refreshing after months of being lied to by people I trusted." We sat in silence for a moment before she continued. "Do you know what the worst part is? It's not the money they stole. Harrison's business will recover from that. It's not even the cruel things they said about us, although that does sting." She stirred her tea slowly, gathering her thoughts. "The worst part is that I can't trust my own judgment anymore. For 5 years, I thought I knew these people. I thought Kimberly was a sweet young mother who was working hard to support her family. I thought Garrett was ambitious, but basically decent. I thought Delilah was efficient and professional, if a bit cold. You weren't wrong about who they could have been," I said carefully. "People choose who they want to be every day. They chose to be dishonest. But how do I know I'm not wrong about everyone else? How do I know I'm not wrong about you?" The question hit me harder than I'd expected, because she wasn't wrong to wonder. I had manipulated our friendship, even if my feelings had become genuine over time. I had used her love for her son as a weapon against people who had wronged me. I had planned and calculated and orchestrated their downfall with the kind of precision that probably should have scared me. "You might be," I admitted. "I'm not sure I know who I am anymore after everything that's happened." That's when she smiled for the first time since the meeting, a small sad smile that somehow felt like forgiveness. "At least you're honest about it." Over the following months, I watched Evelyn slowly rebuild her sense of trust. She started volunteering at a local literacy center instead of the office. She made new friends who didn't know about the betrayal and could see her simply as a kind older woman who loved helping people. She began to laugh again, though it took longer than it should have. Harrison threw himself into restructuring the company's financial oversight systems, implementing checks and balances that would prevent future embezzlement. But I could see the change in him, too. He was more guarded now, less quick to trust, more likely to verify information independently. The betrayal had made him a more careful leader, but it had also made him a lonelier one. As for me, I got promoted to senior budget coordinator and received a substantial bonus for uncovering the embezzlement. Harrison personally apologized for the investigation I'd endured and assured me that my reputation within the company was completely restored, but the victory felt hollow in ways I hadn't anticipated. Yes, I had cleared my name and exposed the truth. Yes, I had gotten justice for what they'd put me through. Yes, I had protected the company and saved Harrison's business from further theft. But I had also learned things about myself that I wasn't entirely comfortable with. I had discovered that when pushed to my limits, I was capable of strategic manipulation that would have impressed the people who had tried to destroy me. I had used an elderly woman's love for her son as a tool for revenge, even if that revenge was justified. The person who had sat in that cubicle 43 days ago, taking abuse and believing that truth and justice would eventually prevail, felt like a stranger to me now. I had become someone harder, more calculating, more aware of the games people play beneath the surface of polite society. 6 months later, I was having lunch with Evelyn at the literacy center where she volunteered. We'd maintained our friendship, but it was different now. More honest, maybe, but also more complicated. She knew I had used her, and I knew she had forgiven me for it, and somehow we had built something real from that foundation of mutual understanding. "Do you ever regret how you handled it?" she asked me as we watched children working with their reading tutors. I considered the question seriously. I regret that it had to happen at all. I regret that you got hurt in the process, but do I regret stopping them? No, even though it changed you, especially because it changed me. I spent 28 years believing that being good and honest and hardworking was enough, that truth would always win out in the end, that people who did wrong would eventually face consequences without me having to orchestrate those consequences. I watched a little girl sound out words with her tutor, her face bright with concentration and pride. Now I know that sometimes good people have to be willing to fight dirty to stop bad people from winning. And I'm okay with being someone who's capable of that fight. Evelyn nodded thoughtfully. My son says the company culture is different now, more transparent, but also more cautious. People are more careful about what they say and do because they know someone might be paying attention. Is that good or bad? Both, I think. Like most changes that come from surviving something difficult, that conversation happened 8 months ago, and I think about it often as I navigate my new position and my new understanding of how the world actually works. I'm good at my job better than I was before because I understand systems and people and motivations in ways I never did when I was just trying to keep my head down and do honest work. That I also know that the person I became during those 42 days of investigation and planning and strategic relationship building is still inside me. She's the part of me that notices when numbers don't add up and when people's stories change and when someone is working too hard to deflect attention from themselves. She's the part of me that learned to be patient and methodical and ruthless when necessary. And honestly, I'm grateful she exists because the world is full of people like Garrett and Delilah and Kimberly. People who will smile to your face while planning your destruction, who will take advantage of trust and kindness and turn them into weapons against you. Sometimes the only way to stop them is to become someone they never expected you to be. So here's what I want you to take from my story. If someone is trying to destroy you, don't just endure it. Don't just hope that truth will win out or that their own guilt will stop them. Pay attention. Gather evidence. Be strategic about who you trust and how you share information. And if you have to use their own methods against them to protect yourself, don't feel guilty about it. Sometimes the most moral thing you can do is refuse to be a victim. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt powerless against people who seemed untouchable, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear that they don't have to take abuse quietly. Subscribe for more stories about what happens when ordinary people decide they're done being pushed around. Because here's the truth. They don't want you to know. You're stronger than you think, smarter than they assume, and more capable of fighting back than anyone expects, including yourself. I invite you to subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people. Thanks to all.